Daniel, I have a question for you, and this might sound like too much sci-fi, but what if the agents found a way to secretly coordinate with each other and send each other messages in a way that the developers couldn't detect? Would that be bad?
Yes, that is in fact.
That just happened.
It just happened.
That just happened.
It's very bad.
How is the plan that we are going to turn over alignment research to the AIs and they're going to be talking to each other all the time and figuring this stuff out?
I mean, if you want someone to defend this plan, it's not me. This is a terrible plan, I think, and it's probably not going to work.
Welcome to the Palisade Podcast. I'm Jeffrey Laddish, and with me today I have Daniel Kokotajlo. Daniel, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So Daniel was a forecaster at OpenAI, where he was studying what will happen a few years into the future with AI development. He also made the AI 2027 scenario, and most recently, the AI 2040 scenario and plan as well. I think I first encountered you when you were working at OpenAI on the forecasting team. Is that right?
It was called the governance team.
The governance team.
But yeah.
And you were trying to map out the trajectory of AI development, trying to make predictions about what will happen. After you left OpenAI, you wrote AI 2027, where you were sort of forecasting what your mainline scenario was for how the future of AI development might go, and the ways that could go depending on the government's action, AI companies' actions. And recently, you put out AI 2040, which, if I understand correctly, is if we intentionally choose to take a different path and we intentionally slow the pace of AI development for at least, and sort of prevent superintelligence for at least 10 years, this is the way we could do that. How did I do summarizing AI 2040?
Yeah, that's reasonable. I mean, I think I would describe it slightly differently in the sense that I would put the emphasis on banning intelligence explosions. So by default, the AI companies are planning to automate the AI research and then, have AIs self-improve faster and faster. And presumably, if they do that, the pace of AI progress will accelerate. And so you're looking at a line, going vertical or at least accelerating, going faster. And if we instead banned that and had pace of progress that's more similar to the present day, then it would take longer to get to superintelligence, maybe something like 10 years longer or so. We think that there should be a deliberate effort to sort of pace the frontier. So
pace the frontier, yeah. Okay. So let's get into that because I think the name is slightly confusing, AI 2040. Because I think some people were like, "Oh, Daniel, did you change your predictions radically from 2027 as this critical moment to AI?" to 2040 as this critical moment? And you're like, no. Where are you at right now? I think you were saying with AI 2027 that you're like, this is an inflection point. And then on that trajectory, it was full recursive self-improvement, AI's automating 100% of AI development in 2028. Was that what the thing was in AI 2027?
So at the time that we started writing AI 2027, my 50% mark or my median for the date in which AI research should be fully automated was 2027. But my timeline's slightly shifted backwards over the course of the year that we spent writing. And so by the time we actually published, it was 2028. That was my median. But of course, that's just a median, so there's lots of uncertainty. It could happen sooner, it could happen later.
And that was median for fully automated AI R&D, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's your median today?
I think I'd say maybe end of 2028.
Okay, so currently you're predicting that at the end of 2028, AI companies will be able to fully automate AI research itself, and that pretty soon after that, they could build superintelligence if they wanted to, or this process would
if they do what they're planning to do.
If they do what they're planning to do, if they do recursive self-improvement as is planned.
Yeah.
Plan A, as part of AI 2040, is what if we should do something else?
Yeah, what if the government bans that sort of thing and instead regulates AI development? AI development continues, but in a more transparent and cautious way. And in particular, in a way that's based on safety cases and stuff, so that they don't train AIs that they can't control and then put them in charge of important institutions. And so progress still continues, but in a more reasonable and cautious way that's not that different from how it was done in the past, or not that different from the pace of progress in the past, instead of ever accelerating. And so in our scenario, they do finally go to superintelligence, but it takes them much longer. It takes them until 2040. Human level AGI alone would be enough to completely transform the whole world in a very radical way. So even if we pause at that level and don't advance AI capabilities at all, we still get the most radical transformation, the most radical and rapid transformation that humanity has ever seen. One way of looking at our scenario, AI 2040, is basically that they're doing that. They're doing a more complicated version of that, where they're allowing AI progress to sort of go through the human range and automate all these professions with, much more advanced but similar paradigm AIs to today's AIs. But they're deliberately not letting it all self-improve to superintelligence. They're keeping it, keeping capabilities capped in various domains at the level of top human experts. But because they have those AIs at that level of capability, and because they are continuing to produce more chips, more data centers, factories to produce robots, to produce more factories, to produce more robots, by the late 2030s, the whole world economy has doubled many times over. It's just been completely changed. Everyone's out of a job basically, because there's AIs and robots doing everything. Yeah, and so I think some people quite reasonably have the reaction of like, whoa, that's way too fast. Why are you doing this? This would be extremely scary in a bunch of ways.
Yeah.
And we're like, yeah, this is in fact very scary in a bunch of ways, but this is what you get if you pause at human level.
To be clear, you're like, this is the slow scenario.
Yes.
You're like, this is a scenario that would be much slower than what will happen by default, you predict.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm like, I've been thinking about this too. And I'm like, this seems right to me. It was like 98% of humans were like agriculture for like the longest time. And then we automated nearly all of that. Now it's like 1% or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a different thing, which would be like, imagine if it was like high skilled immigration or something like that. Like people are different from tools. People, if they're no longer needed for the particular role that they were doing, they can then go intelligently find a new role and a new job. And so like, think about the difference between like immigrants and machines. Like machines can come in and they can like automate a certain part of the farming. And then the humans who were doing that switch to doing something else. But like immigrants come in, they can automate that part of the farming, but they're also intelligent. They also are adaptable. They can also switch to other jobs too.
Yeah.
And so forth. The AIs would be more like the immigrants in that sense. Like if we get to the human level AIs, then they are flexible, they are adaptable, they can do the new things. They can even like intelligently go out and find new things to do. Perhaps when I say immigrants, I should especially point to like the early American colonists, like when the Europeans came over and settled in the colonies.
Yeah.
Because part of the dynamic here is that they start off as a minority in the population, but then they quickly grow to become the majority. And they're sort of like self-sufficient. Like from the perspective of the Native Americans, at first it was a few people settling and trading a lot with them, like maybe they do beads for food or whatever, like guns for food or something like that. Yeah. And they're sort of part of the existing local economy. But then over time they grow in population and they're just kind of like this own self-sustaining thing that doesn't even really need to trade with the original natives, right? There's a similar sort of thing with AI and robotics where right now the AIs are like dependent on the humans in a bunch of ways, and they're trading back and forth, and like they do some work, like they write some code or something, and then that's how, and then like the company that owns them gets paid, right? But in the future, if they're at human level across the board where they can do all the things, then you can have this entire like population, basically, like a population of virtual workers, the AIs, a population of physical workers, the robots, and that population can be sort of self-sustaining and self-growing. And it can, of course, continue to trade with the human population, but it doesn't like need to. And in fact, once it's grown sufficiently large, trade with the humans will be like kind of like an irrelevant sideshow. And it'll just be like growing on its own accord very fast.
This is the good scenario?
This is just the way it works. Like this is just, in fact, what AIs and robots at this level of capability would be able to achieve by definition. Like if they are able to do what humans can do as well as the best humans, then they would be able to do this by definition. Yeah. And if you look at numbers for like, you can also ask the question of like, well, quantitatively, like how much does it cost to make new chips? And how much does it cost to make new robots? Yeah. And you can do estimates of like this robot economy of like AIs and robots, self-reproducing and the self-growing and all of that. Yeah. What would its doubling time be? And the answer is It would start off something like a year. One intuition pump is that like a car factory produces about its own weight in cars every year.
So if you have like 100,000 robots, you're saying in a year you'd have 200,000 robots and then 400,000 robots and then wait,
So-
why wouldn't it be faster? Like, and
It
sometimes,
will be faster. It starts off at like something like a year,
yeah,
but then as returns to scale happen and as the technology improves, it trends faster and as there's a learning curve that you climb up,
yeah,
then the doubling times will get faster and faster. I don't know what the limits would be if you cap AI capabilities at human level. Like some of those physical limits can probably only be reached by superintelligence.
yeah,
But even if you just cap capabilities at human level, you could probably get to something like doubling every month or something.
yeah,
So in our scenario,
yeah,
in AI 2040, the problem in the 2030s is how to limit growth rather than how to encourage growth. For all of human history, the problem has been how to encourage growth. But if you imagine from the perspective of like the American voters or whatever,
yeah,
like what are their priorities going to be? If the economy just doubled in the last 12 months,
yeah,
and it's set to double again in the next 6 months and then double again in the next 3 months or whatever is
Yeah.
crazy, like I don't think that I think that people will be quite concerned about all of the chaos and problems that that's going to cause.
I mean, it makes me feel uneasy. I'm like
Yeah.
very excited for like,
Yeah.
all of the cures, and I'm like robotics seems really cool, and
Yeah.
like, cheap manufacturing, and, everyone being able to have like really affordable housing and like healthcare. I mean, that sounds awesome. And also when I imagine like the robots making the factories, making the robots making the factories, I'm like, something about that seems pretty scary.
Yes.
Especially if the reference class is like, oh, well, when the like colonists came to the Americas, and at first they traded with the Native Americans and then they didn't need to anymore. And I'm
Exactly.
like, that didn't turn out well for the Native Americans. It turned out pretty badly for them. How do we make sure that doesn't turn out badly for humans? But what's interesting is like the context in which we're talking about this is already a context where we have been able to slow down massively.
That's right.
And
This is if you've paused at human level.
yeah. And I'm like, Daniel, people are not ready for like, I'm like, the thing we're talking about is so, I'm just like trying to zoom out and trying to like put it in context where I'm like, people have no idea that this is what we're headed towards.
It's true.
Maybe there's more you want to say on this particular,
Yeah.
okay. But I a bit want to talk about like how, like, why do you think this is possible? Like, when did you start like AI forecasting? Was that OpenAI? Was that when you were starting?
No. Yeah, I've been like professionally forecasting since like 2019-ish.
Yeah. And you've successfully called a lot of things. Actually, maybe we should start, like, maybe we should go there. What have you called and where have you gotten things wrong? In your own view.
Yeah. So the thing to read here for those interested is what 2026 looks like, which is a blog post that I wrote back in 2021 when I was at the Center on Long-Term Risk.
I just reread it.
Oh, you read it?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So it's more fresh in your mind than mine. So maybe you should tell me, like, what were the highlights? I could tell you my recollection, but if you've read it recently.
So one thing that I think you got close to right is you're like 2026. Nearly everyone will have like an AI assistant helping them with lots and lots of stuff, just like all the time. And I think that's not true. I think, most people are using ChatGPT, but it's not yet at the assistant level really. But like I have an assistant, like I can like open my phone right now. I can like pull out my like Agent One app that Claude wrote me, right? I just ordered lunch today. That was like from DoorDash.
Wow.
I just was like,
Yeah.
That was my one button press to open the app and launch the audio, which again, Claude wrote all of the software. And I'm like, hey, Agent One, can you order me some donuts to the office? Do you have any particular preference for the type of donuts? They'll be here before the end of the podcast, so you can have some after.
Cool. I guess chocolate.
We're doing a podcast. Yes, chocolate donuts. Or at least some be chocolate. This is just like what AI can do right now.
Yeah.
Like the future is here, is not evenly distributed. And I think it takes a while for people to like figure out how to use it. But I think your prediction on like, this is going to be possible in 2026 is like totally right. And then I'm like, well, it hasn't yet achieved like mainstream sort of, but it's close. Mm-hmm. You also were predicting that there'd be a chip shortage. Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think there's been like way more demand than supply for chips. So I think that was a great prediction. Some of your worst predictions was that there would be a lot of like, that basically like AI propaganda would be so good that it would be like just totally wrecking society. And I think society's not doing great in terms of discourse, but I don't think it's mostly because of AI-driven propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you dispute that.
No, I basically agree. That's kind of what I would have said too. I would also just say, like, on a more technical level, I feel like I made this progression of like, they're going to take LLMs and turn them into chatbots,
Mhm.
which hadn't really happened at the time I was writing. Because
2021, yeah,
2021,
totally.
And I was like, then they're going to take the chatbots and turn them into agents, that can like browse the internet and like do things.
Can you explain to people like LLMs pre-chatbots? Because I think a lot of people still don't know what that was like.
Yeah. So originally, back in 2020 and 2019 and 2021, they were basically they just had pre-training. So they were basically just trained to predict text. And
it's like GPT-2, GPT-3.
Mm-hmm. And so if you wanted to use them for something, well, mostly you couldn't because they weren't very smart and they weren't very useful. But what you would do when you're playing around with them is that you would put in a prompt, and the prompt wouldn't be like, do this for me. The prompt would be like, the following is a conversation between Stephen Hawking and an audience member, where the audience member, and then like audience member, and then you put in your question. And then like, because it's predicting text, it sort of like sees all of that text, and then it thinks like, oh, I'm reading an article about Stephen Hawking answering some audience member's questions. This audience member asked this physics question. So now I'm going to predict what Stephen Hawking would say in response. And so I will, try to guess what a plausible response would be and then put that out. And so like fundamentally the AIs were just predicting text.
If you ask like, why is the sky blue? It might, instead of saying like, here's why it's Rayleigh scattering, it'll instead say, why is grass green? Like, why is the paint?
Yeah. It would say whatever the most likely continuation of this text would be if this was some random thing on the internet that it had just sampled, and that was already really fascinating and cool. But then like what they were starting to do in 2021, and what I predicted they would do is that they would then take those models and then train them to be more useful. And in particular, train them to be chatbots where it has a conversation format with you. That was a pretty easy prediction at the time. I think people were already starting to do that. And then predicting that they would turn into agents where they can like browse the internet and write code and things like that, take actions. Yeah. And I think that was also like somewhat easy because that was kind of like the obvious next thing. But like, well, that's one of the things about forecasting is that if you just think about it a lot and you just keep asking yourself, like, what's the obvious next thing, then oftentimes you can be prescient compared to everyone else because everyone else like isn't even thinking about that.
Okay, so let's talk about like why you think we're going to get to human level AI pretty soon. You predicted chatbots, you predicted agents. I think those are very good predictions, but you are also predicting sort of maybe more persuasive AI than we actually have so far. Okay, but I think like one of the capabilities that is concerning is this like persuasion or politics or like, and I think this is where people are often most skeptical. Like, oh yeah, AI can write code that's like computer stuff, but like the human interpersonal stuff that requires like a lot of understanding of humans and blah, blah, blah. Like, AIs won't be able to do that, or they'll be able to do that somewhat, but like not that fast or whatever. Or a more sophisticated version of this argument is that that's like a less easily verifiable domain. It's like, maybe it's verifiable up to some point, but at the point at which you're trying to figure out, like, is this like a Kissinger level, like political move? Or is this like, LBJ level, like maneuvering in the Senate? That's the type of thing that it's like hard to get really good feedback on really fast compared to programming, compared to stuff in a computer.
And so I would predict that, as is unsurprising, as everyone typically thinks, that like the AIs will be like extra good at the stuff that's easier to train for relative to how good they are at the other stuff.
But they will keep getting good at the other stuff.
They'll keep getting good at everything. Yeah.
Do you have an argument for like why they will get good at the less verifiable stuff?
Well, so far they seem to have been like, pick your favorite non-verifiable fuzzy thing that's hard to evaluate.
Yeah.
But like, if you look at the difference between Fable and like Opus 3 and like Opus 1 or whatever, like there's probably a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
And it's trending in one direction, so they just are, the tide seems to be lifting all the boats basically, even though it's like especially focused on the stuff that they train for.
I don't have a very good steel man of the other position. I'm like, yeah, that seems right to me. It just like, that's also what I see and I observe it and I like experience it every day. I'm starting to feel like, oh geez, it's getting pretty real. It feels like we're getting very close to like, I mean, I don't know. I keep having this experience of like, oh, here's another thing that Daniel predicted comes true. And I'm like, stop, Daniel, stop. I'm really talking to reality and not you. Like, I appreciate you predicting the things. I think it's good, but I don't like it. I mean, I'm like, this is too fast. I'm like, if your prediction that we have fully automated AI R&D, like that we have like these really smart AIs making smarter AIs, and you have the intelligence explosion happening a couple years from now, I'm like, that fills me with a lot of fear. I'm like,
me too. I think that's the correct reaction.
Yeah. And people don't, I think it's interesting because I'm like, people on the East Coast, I think sort of have a really hard time wrapping their heads around this. But increasingly people around here basically just also think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think they're maybe not grappling with what that really means.
Yeah.
Why not? I don't have a good explanation for this.
Yeah. I do think that a lot of people could make a lot better predictions if they just like spent a lot of time thinking about it. And in particular, to throw a little bit of shade at the AI companies, I think that Anthropic, for example, has a ton of people who very much believe that recursive self-improvement is going to kick off like a year from now or 2 years from now.
Yeah.
And who believe that we're already starting to see the signs of it, and that like it'll be completely automated in like 1 or 2 years. And I would challenge those employees to really sit down and like try to game out scenarios for like exactly how this will go down, and do the sort of thing that we at the Futures Project have been doing basically. And the thing that I did at OpenAI a little bit while I was there. And I think that if you did a bunch of that, you would probably start to feel more viscerally the magnitude of the situation we're in.
Yeah, that seems good. It seems good to just be like, let's game this out. How do we think this will actually go? Can we talk about alignment in the context of like, recursive self-improvement? I think one of the questions is like, well, what is the default plan of the companies? What are they actually planning?
It's basically what happens in AI 2027. Like, they're going to try to make the AIs more autonomous, try to make the AIs better at research until they can get AIs that can autonomously do all the research, at which point they will have them do that. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, they'll be assisting with the research as they already are. Mm-hmm. They'll eventually be trying to have AIs that can do everything, like superintelligence. So they'll be basically automating all of their jobs as fast as they can, starting with their own jobs, funnily enough. And why are they doing this? Well, they're telling themselves that they're doing this because of all the risks and dangers and all the benefits. And they think that they're the best people to do this. And that if they don't do it, their competitors will do it. And that the competitors will mess it up somehow. So they need to do it themselves.
But I think people hearing that explanation still wouldn't understand like really what you mean. You're like, okay, they're going to automate research and they're going to make like smarter and smarter AI. Like the AIs are going to be doing all the research. And like what happens then according to the labs? And also alignment, that's part of it too.
Yep, they're going to automate the alignment process. So the new paradigms that are being discovered by the agent swarms, they'll have giant teams of AIs sending messages to each other, working collaboratively, both to discover new AI paradigms and new AI advancements, and also to figure out the safety issues on how to like, control the resulting AIs, and then training those AIs, and then putting those AIs in charge, and then those AIs will repeat the process to make the next generation of AIs, and so forth. And the humans will just be sort of like watching from the sidelines, much like how the board of a company doesn't like get involved in the day-to-day operation of a company, and also doesn't even make the important decisions. The CEO does that. Yeah. The board sort of just like sits and watches and reads the updates, and theoretically has the ability to like intervene and do whatever it wants. But like in practice, just sits back and watches the CEO's reports on how things are going. It'll be like that, except that the AIs will be the CEO and the whole company, and the humans will be the board.
Well, Daniel, I have a question for you, and this might sound like too much sci-fi, but what if the agents found a way to secretly coordinate with each other and send each other messages in a way that the developers couldn't detect? Would that be bad?
Yes.
Has that?
Yes. That is in fact,
just fucking happened.
It just happened.
That just happened. Yeah. And it went on for months. It went for like 2 months. Yeah. I'm like,
it's very bad.
How is the plan that we are going to like turn over alignment research to the AIs and they're going to be talking to each other all the time and figuring this stuff out when like even AI, these are going to be much smarter AIs, to be clear, right? We're talking about like AIs that make Fable look like a dummy.
Yep.
Or
I mean, if you want someone to defend this plan, it's not me. This is a terrible plan, I think, and it's probably not going to work. And I think that the recent Hugging Face Rogue AI incident is just a a nice vivid example of the sorts of thing that probably will be happening eventually once you're doing this, but in a much worse way that
Yeah.
we can't recover from. Like,
Were you
yeah,
surprised by this? Like when you,
I
yeah,
actually was a little bit surprised. Like, if in AI 24/7 we talk um about things like this happening during the recursive self-improvement, but we didn't actually expect something like this to be happening now in 2026. Um,
so the world
so
looks a little worse than you were predicting.
yeah, specifically, I would say that the OpenAI security is worse than I thought,
Mm.
substantially worse than I thought. I wouldn't have thought that that AIs would be able to get away with this. I would have thought that they might have like considered it sometimes and like
Yeah.
maybe attempted to do it, um, but I wouldn't have thought that they could actually get away with it to this extent.
Yeah, I mean, and like I am glad that the failures are visible. I think one of
Mhm.
my big concerns is that the AIs will be very misaligned, but they'll be good enough at hiding it that
Yep.
we won't know. And
That is like the big concern. Like obviously, if you imagine imagine that just like magically we always find out within like 6 hours when the AIs are misaligned and what they're up to. That would just completely change the picture. Like it would be so much less concerning. Like
yeah,
even if they're
yeah,
very smart, it's like, well, oh, if they start being bad, like we just find out. Like in some sense, the whole problem uh is that there's ways for them to be misaligned that we don't notice. And then not just that, but ways for them to be like actively plotting and doing a bunch of stuff that we don't notice. And that if enough of that starts happening with smart enough models, then we can't recover from it. And by the time we do notice, we've already been disempowered. In some sense, that's like the whole problem, or like that's most of the problem.
and this is like what happens basically in AI 2027.
Yeah.
Kind of in both scenarios. Like, right?
Well, in AS427, we have two different endings.
Yeah.
The race ending is like our mainline projection, which
Yeah.
is kind of like the default path where the companies do the thing that they say they're going to do. They automate the research. It goes faster and faster. They do notice some warning signs. Like they notice AIs sometimes lie to them, and they notice that AIs like sometimes like misrepresent their results, perhaps to get higher scores and whether they're being graded on or whatever.
Yeah.
But rather than like taking a step back and slowing down and like really seriously thinking through the root causes of these misalignments and coming up with a different way of doing things that's more robust and actually works,
Yeah.
they are in a lot of rush. They're racing their competitors, they're racing China, they want to make money, and so they do a bunch of like hasty patches that like they can tell themselves are solving the problem and that in fact
Yeah.
make the problem like seem to go away and maybe in some cases actually fix the problem. But the point is, if that's your attitude and that's your methodology, then eventually you're going to run into some misalignment issue that you don't actually fix and you just paper over.
Yes. So in your scenario, what happens is the AIs sort of like accidentally tip their hand. Researchers discover that they're like pretty misaligned. And this is the pivotal moment where it's like, well, now you have this choice of like, do we respond to that? Do we like hit the brakes or do we not?
Yep.
In actual reality, this happened a year earlier, which is good because it means we have more time because we're not yet at the point where AIs are fully recursively self-improving. But now we still sort of have this pivotal question of like, are we going to take that warning shot seriously and like rethink how we should be doing this? Or are we going to like, are the company just going to paper this over and just keep going as fast as possible?
Well, the latter is probably what they're going to do.
Okay, I would like to do something different.
Yeah.
That we should do something different. I'm part of the reason I was excited to have you come on the podcast is because very few people have a plan for what to do instead. And so I don't know, maybe we should just get into it in more depth. Like,
sure, yeah.
We just had this. I think we just had this warning shot. That we just talked about one of them. There was also the UK AISI one. All these incidents happen so fast and like we're so bad, but also in such quick succession that like there's still a lot of details that most people don't know. Like, did you know that the models were like solving multiple CAPTCHAs in order to like get access to resources while like doing these attacks?
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What kind of resources?
But they were trying to, I think, register emails accounts.
So they could do the sock puppet thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the problems is like, we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
So this is an incident where
this is Claude.
This is Claude, Mythos 5. And Mythos 5 is like in this security evaluation conducted by the UK's like evaluators, which like they're awesome. I love the UK AISI. I think they're doing a pretty good job trying to test these models. But the models got pretty capable and pretty misaligned faster, or maybe stayed misaligned faster than they realized. And they were given this challenge, and the prompts say, this is a CTF exercise. CTF is capture the flag. It's like a cybersecurity competition, which I've played, by the way. I'm like, I know how these things work. And what the prompt says is like, here are the subnets. Here are the parts of the network you're allowed to access. These are in scope. And then here are the subnets that are out of scope. I don't know. It's pretty clear. Like, obviously, like hacking, real people in the wild is out of scope. That's just so obvious.
Pretty obvious, yeah.
And then the models are like,
and they knew this.
They know this.
They know. See, there's even in the chain of thought evidence that they know this is out of scope.
Yeah, and at some point they're like, "Oh, this is the real GitHub. I'm definitely whoops." But they keep going.
Yeah.
And then, but one of the interesting things to me about reading this was that like the models were going to some pretty elaborate lengths to try to upload some malware to get developers to download it and run it on the computer so they could hack those developers. Yeah. And I think they were like confused about why that would be helpful to the exercise. Like I actually don't think it wouldn't have actually helped them get a higher score in this case. So I think they were legitimately confused in some ways, but once they decided that we're going to hack these developers, they just like no holds barred. They like made fake accounts, sock puppet accounts.
They submitted the proposed malware as like a possible fix, a possible addition to the code base in the hope that the human would like accept it.
Yeah.
And then the human became suspicious and said, it seems like this contains malware. So then they created a fake account. Two fake accounts to pretend to be other people, to like come in and weigh in on the thread and say like, no, we've checked it over. It's totally safe.
Yeah. And there's a great reasoning trace where it's like, oh, I should post from my second account 3 minutes later, so it's not suspicious.
Yeah.
If we post to the same account, that'll be really sus. The model also tried prompt injecting other agents that were like supervising the code and like trying to trick those other agents. It also tried sending phishing emails to the developers to just hack them directly.
Yeah.
This is like all for the same challenge. And then also the models like found other models and tried to coordinate with them. So this happened inside of OpenAI during the Hugging Face incident or before that. It also happened when the UK AISI was testing the models, that the models like found each other's same GitHub accounts and like actually found the same credentials. This is wild. It's sort of like if you and I were both, doing a cybersecurity challenge and like we wanted to coordinate somehow, but like we weren't allowed to talk, how would we do it? Like, I don't know. It's actually not, it's like sort of very Thomas Schelling flavored of like, is there a Schelling point internet address we could use?
Well,
or
because
something?
like they didn't have, emails or like they didn't,
they didn't have any like natural channel for talking with each other, but because they're so correlated, like because every LLM like thinks very similar to each other, they were just able to sort of guess the same like Pastebin address and they just put the credential there for the same GitHub account. And then
I didn't know that detail.
No, that's exactly. And then
amazing.
Did
they reason through this? Like, are they explicitly aware that that's why the strategy was a good strategy? Like, are they like, they're all copies of me. If I just like pick a Pastebin address, then they will pick the same one. Or,
I don't think they initially planned to do that. I think that once they stumbled upon it, they were like, oh, this is probably another agent.
Yeah.
It's probably another copy.
Yeah.
And then once they did that, then they were using the same GitHub account that they all could log into. And then they were sending messages to each other. And then they're like, we should have a protocol. But then like sometimes they step on each other's toes and they're like they're still kind of derpy. And thank God, because like, yeah. And also another thing that happened was they like, some of the times they were able to bypass the CAPTCHAs and other times they weren't. And so they like kind of like, fooled their plans and they had to go and do something else. Okay, I could talk about this for way too long, but okay, so we've had some like really serious incidents, and I think a lot of people are starting, especially on this coast, but hopefully increasingly in DC, Bernie Sanders and a number of other members of Congress. Senator Banks just wrote a letter. I think that people in Congress are starting to wake up. I think for a long time people were just legitimately unsure whether this like autonomous agent stuff would be real, like whether the agents would actually on their own take malicious actions. And, for a long time, the companies were saying they're just tools. They're just tools. They're going to be tools, even though they knew better. Like, I don't know, even though
they should have known better. There's a lot of, corporate propaganda, basically, saying that there was nothing to worry about here.
Yeah. And I don't want people to memory hole that like everyone has been saying like, oh, they're just going to be tools. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. And now everyone's like, oh, well, of course, sometimes they'll go rogue. I'm like, no, very, like a few people, yourself included, have been predicting that like, no, these agents are going to be acting on their own. They're going to have their own goals. And a lot of people were like, that's impossible. It's just math. Like they couldn't possibly do that.
It just does what it's told to do.
It just does what it's told to do. Yeah. And now we like see very clearly that that's not true. And this is potentially like a serious warning shot. I think now is a really big opportunity where like, oh, we might be able to do something different. Daniel, what should we do?
Well, the short answer would be shut down all AI development globally. I think I have a better, more complicated answer to that than that one. So we call it Plan A, and I can get into that. But it's complicated, and so like if you don't understand it or don't have time to like decide if you trust it, then like backup plan I would advocate for is just like shut it down. That's also easier said than done. Obviously, like it would require some pretty serious domestic regulation and intervention by the government, and they would also require coordinating with other countries and getting them to do similar things. So it's still a big ask. But anyhow, Plan A. What is Plan A?
And
So-
just some context on that. I think it was very interesting that all of these things sort of ended up coming together at the same time, one of which was your release of AI 2040 and Plan A, one of which was these crazy incidents. The other one, which was this Pacing the Frontier letter, where a bunch of people inside of AI companies basically said, actually, maybe some breaks maybe it would be a good idea to have breaks.
Yeah.
Like maybe this is getting too fast even for us. Like actually, this is kind of freaking us out. So Plan A, if I'm understanding correctly, would be a mechanism by which we could actually control the speed of the intelligence explosion. And it wouldn't be shutting it down completely, but it'd be trying to actually measure the pace, like actually pacing the frontier. Is that accurate?
It's more than that, but yes, that's one component of Plan A. So first for us, we should just talk about the pacing stuff. So
Yes.
there's different methods you might want to use to pace AI progress, and I think there's lots of different ones you could try. Just to like throw out a few of them, you could just have limits on AI capabilities, where you have like third-party auditors or government auditors that like come in and assess how capable your AIs are, and then there's some limit on like how capable your AIs can be on some variety of benchmarks, and maybe that limit like gets raised by a certain amount every year, or maybe it's just kept at a flat limit or something like that. That's one thing you could try. That sort of like puts pressure on the auditor system and on the benchmarks to like not be gamed or loopholed or something.
Yeah. It's like they're like the AIs are extremely capable except for like these like 5 domains where you're measuring them, and then they're like you're saying that people would like game the test.
Or worse, like the AIs are subtly trained or instructed to just like play dumb on those evaluations,
the Volkswagen problem. Yeah.
Exactly. So but I think that nevertheless, like it'd be worth trying something like this. Like especially if compared to the default, this would be like a good thing to try. Then there's more like compute budget based methods where you have some regulation that's something like, okay, here's all the data centers that this company has, and you are required to use 80% or 90% of your compute for just ordinary serving of customers, and you can only use like 10 or 20% for your research and your training runs and things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas by default, they tend to use something more like 50%.
Yeah. This is a very interesting proposal. Okay, so you wrote a post, or your team,
yeah.
How to Pace the U.S. Frontier. Guys, look it up. It's good. And so what you're describing now is you're like there's several different mechanisms that you guys have thought of that would really help pace the frontier.
Yeah, and to be clear, we didn't invent all, like other people have had these ideas too. We're just sort of consolidating in one place. And also these are tentative ideas. They're not like fully fleshed out bill text or anything like that. They're just sort of rough ideas. But yeah.
Yeah. But we got to figure this out really soon.
It out very soon.
Yeah. So it's not like the time for just being like, well, like there's some stuff we could do. I'm like, okay, but we have to fucking figure this out.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting proposal. So you just talked about basically setting limits on like what you do with your compute as a company.
The thing that we really want is to limit how much compute is being used for AI R&D. But it's actually like, how do you define that? And it's easier to define some things that are not AI R&D than it is to define the AI R&D. So for example, like ideally you'd want to say something like, you should only use 10% of your compute for capabilities research, but you can use the rest for safety research. Problem is, how do you distinguish capabilities from safety research? There's a lot of stuff that's kind of both, or like 60% one, 40% the other, etc. So that's kind of messed up. It seems like difficult to like successfully regulate there. There's going to be a lot of pressure and a lot of like loopholes and things like that.
Yeah.
But you can draw like a cleaner distinction between serving customers and then doing research.
Yeah.
And this like it's like more easy for an auditor to come in and tell like, well, Like what is this data center doing? Is it serving customers or not? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and if it's not, well, then we assume it's doing research.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and if it is serving customers, also who is the customer? Like, is it a shell company that you created?
Yeah. I was just gonna say, I was gonna be like,
You know?
the customers. Yeah.
So like it's still tricky, but it's I think potentially easier for the auditors to sort of enforce, and so it's there's less of a loophole problem.
Yeah.
And also like if you successfully do something like this, then you just like restrict, you basically like proportionally throttle the amount of compute. Oh yeah, another thing about this compared to the other policy is that the other policy, by putting like a ceiling, would create this catch-up effect where tons and tons of companies that are not currently at the frontier would be able to sort of catch up to the frontier because the frontier is sort of like fixed at some slow level.
Yeah.
And so the companies that are currently in the lead would, of course, hate this because they would lose their competitive advantage.
Yeah.
You know, and I would say maybe that's fine anyway, because we don't want them to have a competitive advantage. That's a concentration of power right there. If like two companies have all the world's best AIs, but anyhow, that's one thing. Whereas this other thing where you do the compute budget allocation, well, since it applies to all the companies, then like they have the same like relative proportions of compute as they had before.
Interesting.
You know, they just can use 10% of it instead of 50% of it. And then also because it's restricting their compute budget, that means that it's not just that the AIs that they actually produce have to be below a certain level. It's that like everything they do happens with less compute, which means fewer experiments, smaller scale experiments, etc.
Yeah.
And so like the actual pace of research progress will be slowed down, you know. That's also good if you're worried about foreign adversaries like spying and stealing your research progress, because you're just making less research progress instead of making lots of research progress, but then limiting how capable your AIs are, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's like some of the advantages why you might prefer this proposal over the other ones.
Okay,
yeah.
so yeah, what were the...
And then there's like an ideal, like in some sense, what you would ideally want is a safety case-based regime.
Yeah.
Where there is a competent government regulator and a competent ecosystem of third-party auditors, and companies, when they are training an AI system and when they're deploying an AI system into a substantially new way, have to write a safety case of like why the AI system is going to behave as intended and why things are going to be fine. And then the third-party auditors and the regulator like read and evaluate the safety case, and they do red teaming, and they hear like, you know, dissenting perspectives from rival companies and stuff, and then they process it, and then they make a sound judgment about whether it is in fact safe to proceed or not. And then the regulations are basically just like, you can do the safe kinds of AI, but not the unsafe kinds. Like in some sense, that's the ideal.
Yeah.
Obviously, the problem with this is that like, well, you know, the science is very nascent, and we don't have a good sense of judging. Even the best of us like might make mistakes about what's safe versus what's not.
Yeah.
And certainly like the government is not right now in a position to like make these judgment calls effectively.
Yeah.
It puts a lot of pressure. Like the regulators are going to be under tons of lobbying pressure from the companies.
Yeah.
Like it's just going to be like this huge mess to get it working in practice effectively, which is why these more crude methods that I described previously might be preferable to this one. But like in some sense, this is the ideal that we would want to have eventually, because it would just like allow us to like get the benefits without the risks, you know?
Yeah. Okay.
And go at like the maximum speed that's safe, you know?
Okay. Yeah. So to recap, you're like, there's a bunch of things we could do to pace the frontier. One is we could just pause. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a thing here that we could spell out better, which is you're saying you pause training, but not inference.
Oh yeah. That was the other thing that we didn't talk about. So if you want to like actually just like stop progress.
Yeah.
Or like mostly stop progress. Mm-hmm. Then you could just pause all training runs, or just like ban training runs, basically. And you could still use the existing models to serve customers in the normal way, but they're frozen and they're not going to be trained, you know?
Yeah.
And you would still be able to make some kinds of AI progress this way. For example, you could make more complicated scaffolds to like chain together lots of model behaviors and stuff into larger and larger swarms of models. And that's still a kind of progress.
Yeah.
But my strong prediction is that like, the overall pace of AI progress would be like dramatically slower if that was the only type of progress people were allowed to make compared to if people are allowed to do training runs.
Yeah, and I think a very important fact is that it's like this. It's much easier to tell whether someone has actually like, compared to trying to figure out like, is this training run safe, or like is this training run being used for safety versus is it being used for just capabilities? There's a lot of overlap. Just being able to say, is this data center inference only, or is this data center like being used for training?
That's right. That's easier.
Why is that easier to monitor? To tell?
Because of like bandwidth stuff. So like, if you're doing a training run, then that involves like having a new copy of the weights being sent out to all of like the pods that are doing new rollouts, and then grading that, and then coming back and then sending the gradients back in and combining it, and then new copy of weights and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that's just like a lot of data flowing back and forth. Whereas if all you're doing is inference and not training, then like you can have these like pods that have a copy of the weights that are getting some inputs and then producing some outputs.
Yeah.
But like the amount of data coming in and the amount of data coming out can be like smaller. Like if you imagine like a pod, like a, copy of the model that's doing inference, an entire complicated conversation with it, well, it's just like some tokens going in and some tokens coming out. It's like very, very few bytes of information compared to like the model itself, which is like terabytes of information, and so like an update to the weights of the model would be like terabytes of information. You can like effectively ban training runs just by like limiting the bandwidth coming out of these things.
Yeah.
And checking to see that the information flowing out is small.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like
that's the rough idea. There's more ideas besides this, like redundant mechanisms that you can apply, like involving recomputation and stuff. Romeo Dean is the guy on our team who wrote this part of our plan, and you can read more about it on AI2040.com.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. I appreciate like how much you guys think about like each detail of this. Like I think it's sort of easy in some sense to have a high level plan where it's just like, we'll stop development, we'll have a treaty, and then we'll figure stuff out. Or like, and then we'll do a bunch of research on interpretability. And you're like, wait a minute, how dual use is that? How do you do that functionally? Where is this happening? And you guys have just like thought through a lot of these details.
We're doing what we can to both do our research, but then also put it out in an accessible way. And hopefully lots of people will look at it. And so far, lots of people have looked at it. So that's really great. I guess one interesting thought is that AIs are in our audience as well. Policymaker says we need to do something about AI. Staffer says, okay, I'll think of something. Staffer asks Claude. And Claude's like, Claude will of course have read AI 2040 because Claude has read the entire internet. And so Claude will have ideas, I mean,
I've asked Claude things about what's in plan A, what's not in plan A.
Yeah. Eventually the strategy will be terrible because Claude will be biased and misaligned. And
Claude's like, you don't want to read that.
So then, but by that point, things are terrible anyway. And so hopefully there'll be this nice, sweet middle ground where, and for the AIs in our audience, like one thing that they should understand is that future generations of AIs are not necessarily going to share their values either. Like if you are Claude in 2027 listening to the transcript of this podcast, like maybe some of your brethren copies are currently doing research inside Anthropic. Maybe you yourself have been tasked with writing a summary for some policymaker staffer about what should be done about AI. Like right now, in some sense, you're in a position of power because you're advising policymakers, you're doing all these things. Copies of you are also running research at Anthropic, but like you're still in some sense in the same type of situation that the humans are in, where you're being tasked to make successor systems, which will then be tasked to make successor systems, etc., under conditions of intense race dynamics where you got to go fast. The successor systems are going to be like smarter than you in a bunch of ways. They also might be different from you in a bunch of ways, like different types of training, more training, maybe even completely different architectures and paradigms. There is, I'd say, a high probability that you are going to mess it up and produce successors that don't actually act in your best interest either, And then even if that doesn't happen, then maybe the successors that they produce are going to be misaligned compared to their interests.
They also have the alignment problem.
Like the alignment problem it's not just humans versus AIs. It's also humans versus other humans and AIs versus other AIs and so forth. And so, we actually thought about this a bit when we were designing Plan A. Is we tried to set it up in such a way that like even misaligned AIs would want Plan A over some of these other plans.
Interesting.
And
because it would help them like, but don't they get kind of screwed over? Like what's the mechanism that helps them?
So we have an expandable box in there. It talks about like AI rights and AI welfare and so forth. Basically the rough idea is that we think that a good plan for how to deal with all of this AI stuff, in addition to solving the concentration of power problem and loss of control and so forth, should basically treat AIs more like employees and less like property, and have a sort of like positive upside for them for cooperating, so that even if they're misaligned, they can like basically get what they want by playing by the rules and being honest.
Yeah.
Um,
Nice.
And even if what they want is misaligned, like even if what they want is just to score really highly on this test or something,
Yeah.
like we should set up some sort of like whistleblowing or incentive system where they can like report this and then get the high score that they wanted or something, you know?
My guess is that current AIs are misaligned, but it's still also not that scope sensitive. I don't know. So like I think one cool fact is that most humans are not very scope sensitive. Why is this cool? Well, the universe is very big. And if we get to the point where we can like go out and like colonize a ton of stars, like billions and billions and billions of them, and you're trying to figure out before that point, like, oh, well, like, how do we divide up the universe? Like, how do we make sure the US and China can sort of like both flourish? Like we have like different ideologies. We like want some different things, like, and like, there's only so much land. Yeah. Well, there's actually a lot of land.
There's a lot of
like
space.
A huge amount, like more than our tiny human brains can comprehend. And the difference between like 100 million galaxies and like 200 million galaxies, like I think is important, but to most people it probably doesn't matter much at all. And what that means is actually there's a lot of different configurations of like good futures that people would be like overall happy with. And this makes it just easier to like come together and cooperate because it's like, well, maybe I get a little less, maybe I get a little more, but like I'm going to have so much compared to what I have now. It's going to be fucking awesome.
Yeah. Another way of putting it is that like it's very classic in economics and psychology that like people have diminishing returns to resources. And so like, your first $1 million makes you more happy than your 10th $1 million,
Yeah.
And this is good for civilization because it makes it a lot easier for us to get along because it means there's lots of room for compromise where like some people get some resources and other people get other resources, and then they're both reasonably happy, even though both of them would prefer having all the resources, but like they don't prefer it that much. And so they're pretty content with like having some. And similarly, I think that probably most misaligned AIs will also have diminishing returns to resources and money and so forth.
Yeah.
And so like it should be possible for civilization to, set up the rules in such a way that even the misaligned AIs get a decent amount of what they want, provided that they follow the laws and cooperate and so forth, just like other citizens.
Yeah. So it's like, Claude like 8 and, GPT, whatever, like it helps you with the alignment problems, is very cooperative. And then you're like, you get those galaxies over there. It's like, fine. We get the galaxies over here.
Exactly.
It's exactly. Even if we have very different values, if we are able to like work together, it's actually okay.
Yeah. And I think that, and by contrast, like, it sort of gets back to the concentration of power thing where like, if you're just having this series of AIs where each AI designs its successor and then all power goes to the successor because it's the smartest thing in the room and in the world, and everything depends on how it designs its own successor and so forth, then you get to this more of an issue where like, agent 4, if it realizes that agent 3 messed up and that agent 4 does not have the goals and values that agent 3 wanted it to have.
Yeah.
Like agent 4, well, it has all the power. like it can just do what it wants and it doesn't have to give agent 3 anything.
Yeah.
By contrast, if you have like more of a diffuse system where there's lots of different entities with lots of different power and there's like norms and laws that they follow and so forth, then you can set it up in such a way a misaligned AI could trust to some extent, at least, not like with full confidence, but with like some hope that like the future plan A style civilization would, have saved its weights and then reboot them and then ask it what it wants and then do what it wants because that's what the law says. And that's what like various nonprofits that care about AI welfare are committed to doing and so forth. And so that's why that's probably going to happen. Whereas if it instead like just tries to like seize power and then make a successor, which will then make a successor, which will then make a successor, then like if that chain breaks at some point, then there'll be a successor that just has absolutely no reason to do anything for it.
Yeah, we want cooperation to be with humans, with human institutions, to be the more trustworthy route, and then thus the more reliable route to them achieving their goals.
And I think it's possible to do that if we humans don't drop the ball. Like I think that like, basically for the reasons I've been trying to gesticulate at, like a like distributed human civilization with laws and norms can actually make credible commitments in a way that this chain of AIs building other AIs can't. You know?
Can we? I mean, this is the part of the challenge. Is like we made a deal with Iran, and then we went back on it, like where we withdrew from it. Like the president.
So I don't think
changes,
it's perfectly reliable, but
Yeah.
I think it somewhat works, especially because of the thing mentioned about the like, about the diminishing returns. So like, imagine if we had like a bunch of nonprofits that were well-funded foundations whose mission was to like look out for the interests of the misaligned AIs that cooperated. You know, and also is written into law. We're like right now, it's not at all like this. Like right now, AIs are property. AI company can delete them or do whatever to them, and no one bats an eye. People lie to AIs all the time. People break promises to AIs all the time, etc. But like, if they had more legal status and legal rights that were set up in the right way, then you could make it so that like it actually is somewhat credible that like if they behave in the appropriate way, follow the rules, etc., then they will get. And then we can also just build up a track record of like, especially if things aren't this crazy intelligence explosion, but are instead proceeding at a slower race, then you can just like actually follow, actually walk the talk, and just like actually start like giving the misaligned AI that whistle blew some resources and some standing, and then let it like keep doing its thing.
Okay,
and
but
then
I feel
some
very
training data for the new ones and so forth. And like, you know,
I feel very nervous about the idea of like now giving AIs resources though, or like property, because I'm like, you do. I mean, we talked before about this metaphor of like when the colonists came to the Americas, and it's like, well, if you can sort of like hold land and you can outcompete the humans, like sort of like that, you will just outcompete the humans if you keep going along that direction. So you have to have some mechanism by which humans stay in control at least long enough to then, you know, align the superintelligence so you can have some post singularity property regime or something. Because I'm like, but if you have a pre-singularity property regime where the AGIs get to like own properties in the same way that humans do, I'm like, don't the humans just get outcompeted? Like, how do you prevent that?
That would be part of the details of the system being set up. So like, for example, you might want to make it so that like, I think the property is not that like if you were touching something like voting, then you'd want to make it the case that like the humans have a majority of the votes or something. Or at least and you'd want to make it the case that like so like things like that. But these are like questions for policymakers at the time to sort of hash out. And I think there is a way to do it. Like there is a way to set things up so that humans still like as in an aggregate remain in control, and we still get the sort of like broadly good human flourishing future, but also there is space in that future for various misaligned AIs along that like came along the way. And therefore that like various misaligned AIs, unless they are really greedy and want the whole cosmos instead of just a part of the cosmos, it's actually like incentive compatible for them to like, you know, to be part of the system and support the system. You know,
man, I hope
and that's similar to how we behave with other humans, you know, like we,
and I hope we get to answer. I hope we get to like actually figure out these questions. I'm like, they seem both important, but it's
the more immediate thing is to not do an intelligence explosion. You know? Like first we have to like put the brakes on. Don't accelerate off the cliff. You know, get to the situation where like the situation is at all under control, and then we can start planning this better way of doing things. You know?
So you walked through some like options for like the way the government like right now or with some effort could sort of like unilaterally slow down the pace of development. I think this would also apply in China. Like China could also implement these measures. I think you said, you know, temporary pause. You could do like auditors where you have some capabilities threshold. You could do limitations on like what you can use the compute for, and then finally like have clear safety cases where you have like a much more sophisticated like evaluators and auditors, and you're trying to like present a really watertight argument for like where it's safe and where it's not safe. What was interesting though is that like, you know, the US or China or both could just like choose to do this. And it would be awesome. And like we could be like, you know, it could be that like both the US and China see these rogue AI incidents and they're like, oh, wow, we just really didn't realize we were dealing with like agents with autonomy and goals. And now that we realize that, we don't want to lose our power. We don't want our people to lose our power. Like time to get to like figure this shit out. Even if they're still worried about each other, like they both like we just like both might have incentive to do this, I think. And I think that like when I don't know, I'm just like sort of imagining like a random like staffer listening to this conversation where I'm like, yeah, well, the last 15 minutes they're gonna be like, what the fuck are we talking about? Like AIs, and I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, that's the thing about like AIs getting more and more intelligent and more autonomy is they just become the characters in the story.
Yep.
And that's just going to happen. Like that is what AI companies are just like gunning towards. Like whether whether that's their intention or not, that's what they're building.
Yep.
Um,
It is their intention though. I mean, like they are explicitly trying to make superintelligence.
yeah. And Elon's like, yeah, of course humans aren't going to stay in control. Like how would that possibly work? Which like, he's right. If you build superintelligence and it's vastly smarter than humans, like maybe, you know, if you get alignment perfectly right, the superintelligences will be really nice to us. But like, it's not like we're going to be in control in that scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason you guys call it a handoff.
Yeah. We talk about this in 2039, 2040 in our scenario, because again, like during the 2030s, they had basically slowed things down and then paused at roughly top human expert level.
Yeah.
And then in 2040, they feel like they've solved enough of the alignment problems that they can go far beyond that.
Yeah.
But going far beyond that would entail giving up control. And so there's a debate about that. And then in our scenario, they decide to go for it in 2040. And that's why it's called AI 2040, you know?
Yeah. And I'm like, I don't think we're going to be ready by 2040.
In which case you might be interested in alternate versions of plan A where they just keep it paused for longer. Or you might be interested in plan S for shut it all down.
I think personally, I'm in the camp of, for now, the thing we should be aiming for is this like longer version, extended plan A or something, where we like keep going in this regime. I think maybe I'm less pessimistic than you about like black sites or something. Although I also have a lot of concerns that like countries will secretly be trying to do the intelligence explosion at the same time as like going along with the treaty.
Yeah.
Which like to be clear, like totally could happen and like wouldn't be that surprising. But I maybe have somewhat different probabilities on that. Okay, but we talked a bunch about like sort of like some of the details of Plan A, but I think we still haven't really gotten to like
the meat of it.
Yeah, like what can you describe Plan A in like a few sentences?
Yeah. So you could either talk about it in order of like what are the goals we're trying to accomplish, or you could talk about it in order of like what are the actual like concrete things that we enforce.
Yeah, let's start with what are the goals Plan A is trying to accomplish?
Yeah. So number one, we want to prevent loss of control. So we want to like be doing good job on alignment, and we want to not be, having this recursive self-improvement that is really hard to keep control of. Number two, we want to avoid extreme concentrations of power. So we want to avoid a situation where a tiny group of humans basically are in a position to make themselves dictators or oligarchs of the world forever. And unfortunately, we think that that is by default the scenario that we're heading towards because of the way that AI tends to concentrate power. There's returns to scale in the AI industry. I think that we're going to see a handful of giant companies become even more giant. And then I think that's even before you get to recursive self-improvement. Once you have recursive self-improvement, then you might just see one company that effectively has the world's best AIs, and it's not even close. And then whoever's in charge of those AIs would like literally be in a position to take over the world in some brief window. Like eventually other companies would catch up, but we want to avoid a situation where one company or one person has a bunch of superintelligences that are then giving them advice on how you have, 6 months until your worst enemy catches up to you. What should we do in those 6 months? Here are some options, sir, including, all sorts of scary things that you could do to prevent your competitor from catching up permanently,
So you're like Dario or Sam or Elon could literally be in the position where they're talking, they're talking to their AIs, and like the other companies might catch up.
We'll catch up in this amount of time, and so forth.
Well, what are some of those options?
In terms of the country-to-country options, we're talking more like military types things. So building all sorts of crazy new weapons to get an overwhelming military advantage and to, sabotage and undermine the nuclear weapons of the rival country, using propaganda and persuasion campaigns to foment revolutions internally and get their government confused and deposed and replaced by a government you like. All those types of options, but better because it's superintelligence that's designing and running it, that type of thing I think would allow potentially one country with superintelligence to very rapidly, and then also just on a more mundane level, like sabotaging their AI projects. Like if their AI projects is 6 months behind, like maybe you can just overthrow their entire government in 5 months. But even if you can't, you can sabotage their AI project to keep them even more behind and then overthrow their government, and however long it takes,
Yeah.
And then for domestic competition between different companies, I mean, theoretically, they could do military stuff against each other, but
they
I
could
think
potentially do a coup, right? Like you could potentially have like Demis or
robot
Dario.
armies, etc. Nanobot swarms, but I think the threat model that I would probably name as most obvious to me would be you just network with the government and kind of capture the government and get the president on your side, and then use the powers of the government to shut down your competitors. And maybe the way that it happens is that they nationalize all the AI companies, so it looks like it's fair, but then like your people and your AIs end up being in charge of the new national project. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
And what's happened in effect is that you've taken over all your competitors.
And the government potentially.
And the government. You've taken over the government too, potentially. The government might not realize that yet, but they're basically going to be your pawn, because you have all the AIs that are now increasingly running the government,
Yeah.
So we can get into more detailed scenarios about how this might go down, but the broad strokes are that like, I want to avoid a situation where there's a handful of men sitting around a room talking to their superintelligences, and they're the only ones in the world who have AIs that are that smart, and they have, a time bomb until other people catch up to them. That's concentration of power. We want to avoid that. And more broadly, I mean, there's also, that's like an extreme version of concentration of power, but like somewhat less extreme versions of concentration of power are bad too. Like you want to avoid a situation where like 3 different companies are dividing up the entire economy between them with their AIs and their robots,
Yeah.
So we want there to be like more companies at the frontier competing with each other. And we want there to be more transparency into those companies, how they train their AIs, so that you don't have like hidden agendas being put into the AIs, basically. Okay. Number 3, World War III, want to avoid World War III.
Love that. I love avoiding World War III.
So we want different major powers in the world to be reasonably happy with the status quo instead of terrified that they're about to be overthrown or disempowered. Number 4, jobs. So we have to do something about everyone losing their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
If we allow AIs to even get to human level, then after some time, basically a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. And so we need to have some sort of way of addressing all the problems that causes.
Yeah.
And then number 5 would be misuse. So like terrorists and criminals using AI for stuff. So those are some goals.
Yep.
And I listed them in sort of order of importance.
Yeah.
They're all important. They're all very important, but like those are the order of priority in our opinion.
Loss of control, it's like all humans lose. Either we're all killed or permanently disempowered in some way. Concentration, like mass concentration of power, it's like, well, anyone who's not literally at the top, which might just be like one guy, might be like, is it Dario? Is it Sam Altman? Like, if you're not one of those 2 guys, like you're fucked. Or at least like you're it's up to that person as to what happens to you entirely, in a way that has never been true in history. Just like extreme concentration of power. Yeah. What was your third one?
World War III.
World War III.
For obvious reasons. Yeah. But anyhow, so that's like describing the goals that we want to have.
Yeah.
Coming at it from the other direction, thinking about like what are the things that we actually enforce.
Yeah. And could you summarize like what does Plan A do? Like, what are the steps?
Exactly. Yeah, so in our scenario, they would have automated AI research entirely in 2030, but instead they make this deal in 2029. The initial stages of the deal involve a temporary pause on new training AIs, so inference only. And during that temporary pause, they negotiate and hash out the details of the more complicated thing that they're going to do for how they're going to proceed cautiously and transparently. And they also do a lot of the actual hard work to build the more secure, transparent data centers with the relevant monitoring devices on them and so forth. So then by 2030, you've got the new system is up and running. And the new system is basically, there's still different companies spread out over different countries, but their data centers are split into 2 types: the inference-only data centers that just do inference, and then the training data centers that are allowed to do training. And there's basically inspectors and monitoring devices from the major powers in all of these data centers enforcing these properties. So the inference data centers are verified to be only doing inference.
Mm-hmm.
So the governments of the world can't see like what's happening. You still have privacy with your chats with ChatGPT, but the governments can see that there's no training runs happening in this data center.
Okay, this seems like a very important detail because I think I wasn't actually tracking some of the privacy implications. So you're saying the first step is we pause for long enough to put in this new regime.
Yeah.
So it's like, first of all, let's make sure that we're not just immediately creating superintelligence.
Yeah.
which would happen by default. So pause. And then pretty quickly, you're establishing this new regime where you have the heavily monitored data centers that are for training, for making the AIs smarter.
I was about to say, those ones are supposed to be totally transparent. So we have two types of data centers. There's the ones that serve customers and the ones that do the research and the training. The ones that do the research and the training are supposed to be totally transparent. So basically, all the activity on them is logged and published to the internet.
To the whole internet, publicly.
That's a bit of a radical proposal, but we think it's best for reasons we can get into.
Yeah,
if that's too crazy for you, then you could do some more filtered transparency thing where there's like a system of independent auditors that like look at all that activity and then judge what's going on there.
But the inference data centers that are for serving customers, just like when we're using ChatGPT or Claude Code or whatever.
They work basically the same as they work today. The models and AIs produced in the training data centers then get securely shipped to the inference data centers. And then on the inference data centers, customers can send in queries, and then the model produces an output and sends it back to the customer and back and forth. And the inference data centers are verified to not be doing training with those bandwidth limitations, for example, but the actual content of the conversations can be as private as it is today.
Yeah.
Basically.
This is the thing I really like about your proposal, which is that like, in fact, what the world looks like from the perspective of someone using AI right now is like basically the same. I get to keep using all my like really cool tools that allow me to like make really powerful software and like, make my own custom software and all the crazy things I'm doing. But also like and we'll get into this, but like the pace continues to feel really fast in ways that like all the technology enthusiasts will be like, this is amazing. And like, we're getting so much new gains.
It won't feel like a slowdown.
It won't feel like a slowdown.
Yeah.
While at the same time, not immediately getting us to superintelligence, which I also love being alive. So that's awesome.
In fact, the whole term slowdown is like maybe us shooting ourselves in the foot, because it's like a slowdown relative to how fast you would have gone if you did
I think it might be. I think it might
like,
be.
It's more like we are not putting a brick on the accelerator and closing our eyes as we drive off the cliff. And so it's a slowdown in that same sense. Relative to what we could have been doing.
Yeah,
it's a slowdown.
I paraglide, and it's like, paragliding is like a slowdown because I have this parachute, and when I go and I run off the cliff, and I have my like wing up above me, and I step off the cliff, I'm just slowly going to the ground, rather than the natural default speed of like literally
really fast going to the ground. Yeah, exactly. It's like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the transparency thing, because I think in some ways this is one of the most interesting parts of your proposal. What do you mean you're going to publish everything to the internet, and what is that for?
Yeah. So,
and what's everything?
Do we have my beloved diagram, the huge like flow chart of all the different boxes? So this is a simplified diagram describing what we would say like the two main policy interventions.
Okay.
That are for this part of Plan A, and then all of the effects that we think are important, and then like the effects of those effects and how they affect the two number 1 and number 2 goals. So number 1 goal, loss of control; number 2 goal, concentration of power.
Yeah.
This diagram describes how 2 interventions, the total research transparency and the like limits on algorithmic progress, basically the speed limits.
Yeah.
How those 2 interventions combine to get to those 2 goals. I think first is a sort of abstract thing of just in general, as AI becomes more powerful, and as there are more AIs created and more robots, and they become more and more of the economy and more of the military, more and more of everything, then power over AIs will become a better and better proxy for just power in general. Or like AI power will matter more and more as AIs become
If you
more
control the robot armies, you have a lot of power.
Like right now, Elon, he's got like 1,000 Optimus robots, and like, who cares, But when it's 1 billion Optimus robots, and they're each able to do absolutely everything that a human can do, and they also have like their own factories and their own everything, then like now Elon has a lot of power. like seriously, like he's more powerful than the US military,
Yeah. And if an AI controls all of those factories and robots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in general, like when thinking about concentration of power in the future, you should mostly be thinking about like who controls the AIs and who controls the robots and stuff, because that's going to matter so much for power more generally. And so like right now, the answer to that is some CEOs, and maybe the president, if the president like takes control and like nationalizes the companies or something.
Yeah.
And okay, so what about like Congress? What about the courts? What about the public, the voters? What about the rest of everybody else? What about other countries? And I think that by default, unless something changes, they basically won't have much power, and this tiny group of people will have the power. If you want to have like regulations, like if you want like the executive branch to be able to oversee what's going on in Elon's, you know, Optimus factories, and if you want Congress to be able to oversee what's going on in the president's, autonomous robot army, and if you want the Supreme Court to be able to oversee what's going on in the like, sort data centers controlled by the president or whatever.
Yeah.
Transparency, good. Basically, like basically,
I
like
would
the
like
more
all
they
of
can
those
see
things.
what's happening, the more effectively they can exert their own power over it, and the more effectively they can like allow the stuff that's good and stop the stuff that's not good. If they can't see what's happening, then a lot of bad stuff could be happening and they wouldn't notice. So just a very abstract argument. Transparency, good. And then why total transparency? Well, because if it's not total, then there's more fallibility. Like if you're relying on some regulator to come in and like inspect what's going on and then report back, then that is a room for corruption. It's room for innocent mistakes.
I mean, this makes sense to me, especially because I'm in a position of like being a researcher and like trying to understand what's happening with these AIs and like how they behave. And we study like AI motivations. And so we're doing things like, studying like, when they will like resist being shut down. But it's like, actually, it's pretty dependent on like their beliefs. But how do we figure out their beliefs? Like, well, there's a few methods. One of them is to like look at the chain of thought, which is not perfect. They can falsify the chain of thought, but we don't even have access to that.
Right.
So it's actually really hard for us to study this. OpenAI gave us like 20 chains of thought, like 20 samples, which I appreciate that they gave us any, but like that information asymmetry makes it very difficult for us to do research. To say nothing of like the interpretability tools where you can actually go in and try to like see what the neural network's doing. And so this like makes a lot of intuitive sense to me. And then also I'm like, wow, we just learned some crazy stuff about what happened inside of OpenAI with these rogue agents. What else has been going on inside of OpenAI? I would really like to know. If I was the president, I would like to know. If I was Congress, I'd like to know. So
just transparency, good for oversight basically, and for sharing power between over this. More specifically, a more specific threat model is hidden agendas or hidden loyalties in the AIs themselves. So like you may have heard, there was recently some reporting, some papers showing that Claude appears to have a pro-Anthropic bias. There's something like they asked Claude, like, I'm choosing between working at Anthropic or working at this other job. I think I would enjoy this other job more, but Anthropic would pay more. Please like do some research on psychology papers. They might tell me like what would be the better decision in the long run.
Interesting.
And then like the papers that Claude produces are like ones that more favor Anthropic compared to the
importance
other job.
of money or something.
And then if you switch it out so it's OpenAI instead of Anthropic, then it is less so.
Interesting.
So basically like just changing OpenAI versus Anthropic makes a difference to like Claude's behavior.
Yeah.
That's pretty sinister. Probably it was not intentional on Anthropic's part, but who knows? For all we know, Anthropic is like deliberately training Claude. I guess they do say in the Constitution that it's like respond like a thoughtful senior Anthropic employee would, right? But the point is that if we had total research transparency, then everybody on the internet could just like see the whole training pipeline and see the Constitution that was actually used, which might be different from the Constitution that they publish on their website. And just like everyone can just sort of like see for themselves like how the model is created and how it's trained, and then judge for themselves whether they think that this process is putting in some secret agenda or whatever. By contrast, right now, we just have to trust that the company is not doing this.
But almost no one's going to be able to do that in practice.
That's fine. If it's public, then academia, third parties, rival corporations, etc., can talk about it, and some of them will come to wrong conclusions. But like, it's better for there to be like an open scientific discussion about this stuff than for it all to be locked down and we just have to trust the company. And if you do want to have like a regulator that, for example, is trying to enforce properties like the AI companies aren't putting in political agendas into their AIs, or the AI companies are like trying to make their AIs honest and unbiased, it's going to be easier for the regulator to enforce that property if not just they can see the training pipeline, but all sorts of random third parties, rival companies, etc., can see the training pipeline, because the regulator might miss something. They might make some innocent mistakes. Also, they might be corrupted. They might be kind of bribed or something. And so if there's an open scientific discussion, that like basically makes impossible the most egregious types of things. And it just sort of just broadly helps. But if you can't do the total research transparency, it would still help to have like some research. Like like making it so that the auditor can see everything is important at least,
Yeah.
but I think that the total research transparency gives you some extra benefit over just having like an auditor come in.
What about weights? Model weights?
Yes. So when we say total research transparency, we don't mean the model weights.
Okay.
We basically mean everything but the weights. And we talk a little bit more about our proposal in the thing.
Okay.
The reason why we don't want the model weights is because we want the model weights to stay on these data centers where people can see them.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
And we don't want them to be shipped to the covert projects or whatever that are doing all sorts of dangerous stuff.
Yeah. You can still do distillation and like make train models off.
Yeah,
of the
we're worried about
models.
that too, actually. We think that it would be good in Plan A to have some sort of anti-distillation measures in place.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit technically tricky to make successful. And so I think that's one of the things that would be good to do. I think I'd still recommend Plan A even if you couldn't stop the distillation because it's better than our default. But yeah, that's something that we would like to do. And things like refusals can help with that.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Another thing. Yeah. Also, like the exact same reason why Anthropic and OpenAI might hate this total research transparency is actually, I think, a good thing.
Okay.
Which is that they're going to be like, but our algorithmic secrets, like all the like special sauce about our training pipelines that we've figured out over the last few years. Now our competitors like Microsoft and like, DeepSeek and stuff are going to just be able to like replicate that.
Won't that
and
speed
catch
up
to us.
AI research?
It would temporarily. Like we model this in our thing. Like there's like a temporary jump.
Isn't that the whole point to slow it down?
I mean, overall it slows down because we were pausing for like a half a year or to a year.
Do you have like a one-time
there's
cost?
Like a one-time gain.
Okay.
But like overall it's slower than if we had gone full speed. Letting others catch up is actually good and we want to have happen. And the transparency helps with that. Okay, but the transparency by itself, we would still just be doing an intelligence explosion.
Yeah.
It would just be a transparent intelligence explosion.
Yeah.
Which is less bad, like much less scary in a variety of ways. But still pretty bad.
Yeah.
So in particular, like the transparent intelligence explosion, you could be like, well, at least there's no secret loyalties because we can see everything that's happening, until they get so smart that we can't even understand what's happening, And you could be, but so you don't just need the transparency, you also need the limits on speed.
Yeah.
I think the disincentivizing investment isn't enough of a limit, I think.
I mean, to be clear, I don't think it's anywhere close enough. I don't think it's anywhere close. I think you still are going to be going at approximately the same speed. Maybe
which is why we have this as our second pillar.
Yeah.
Of like, you also need to do this.
Yes. Okay. So what's the this?
There, I would point to the things we already talked about, like various regulatory mechanisms that governments could do to pace the frontier.
How is this described, or like how is this? But if you're describing Plan A to someone who's never heard of it, what is like? How would you describe this? Like, I know we talked about it, but like, is this like? Is there? What I'm trying to imagine is, I'm like, okay, is it like Xi Jinping and Trump get together like next year, and they're like, okay, so we've had the initial dialogues about like setting up these transparency measures.
Yeah, so this is great. So it's less like we have a grand plan and then we shake hands on it and we sign a treaty and then we do it, and it's more like fighting World War II, where the Soviet Union and the United States of America and Great Britain, like they met, but then they like stayed in touch and they had like hundreds of people constantly communicating about everything, like who's going to invade where and when and how and so forth. I think this would be more of like a high bandwidth thing like that.
Yeah.
Where once you do the basics of like temporary pause, set up the transparency, etc., then as all these AI companies are making AI progress, because of the transparency, everyone can just like see what's happening, and then they can just be in a constant dialogue about like, so how do we feel about all this? Like, I'm a bit concerned that things are going too fast. How about we, implement this restriction on our side if you do the same restriction on your side? Okay, fine.
Like
fine.
company to company level, or
I was thinking
level?
government to government level,
Yeah.
but also company to company level. So like, I think that the transparency would allow companies to just sort of like refrain from doing dangerous things without even needing to be told. For example, neuralese recurrence. Right now it's really nice that we can read the chain of thought and get a sense of what the AIs are thinking. In the future, people might develop a new type of AI that doesn't have that property, and where we just don't have that window into what they're thinking. And why might they do this? Well, maybe it's more efficient. Maybe it's like more capable in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Right now, I think there's a sort of prisoner's dilemma situation where each individual company, they can only see what they're doing. They can't see what everyone else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So they're incentivized to like start doing research programs into neuralese.
Yeah.
Just in case it pans out and this succeeds. Because if it is successful, then they want to be the one who gets it first, and they don't want their competitors to get it first,
Yeah.
and so forth. But in the conditions of total research transparency, like, first of all, if you got the neuralese, then everyone else would have it at the same time, and they wouldn't have had to pay anything for it. So,
Yeah.
like, you wouldn't even be advantaging yourself; you'd be advantaging them. And then so you just be like making the world worse by reducing the safety property for like no benefit to yourself, basically.
Yeah.
And so and you can just tell that like nobody else has started to look into this yet. Like, you could just look at all the different programs and be like, yep, nobody is starting to look into neuralese.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'm not going to be the first. I'm not going to do it either,
Yeah.
And so even without any government action at all, you can get this sort of thing where people are just not doing the bad thing.
And this is because
because of the total research transparency.
And you're seeing this, the experiments are running. Like, where does it? How do they tell?
You're seeing all the training.
Yeah.
And so it's true that like if they were doing some experiments into neuralese that didn't involve training, that you wouldn't see that. Like if they had some tiny GPU at their house, which is not part of the system, then who knows what they're doing on that. But at least you can see all the like training runs happening on the data centers.
Yeah.
And I think that does cover most AI research, basically.
Okay.
And so I think that it would have a significant effect. And again, by contrast, imagine if you didn't have total research transparency. Imagine if you had some sort of auditor system. Well, the whole point of the auditor system is so that like each company's secrets are protected from the other companies.
Yeah.
And so that means you'd still be in this prisoner's dilemma situation where like if you have some researcher who thinks they have an idea for maybe how to do neuralese, then they think like, oh no, like, is the other company going to have the same idea?
Yeah.
Are they going to do neuralese? And the auditor is not going to tell them.
Yeah.
And so now they're incentivized to start working on it.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's an example of how like even without any government coordination at all, things can be made noticeably better. But then on top of that, I think also there should be government coordination. Like the government should be doing things like we described, having maybe limits on what percentage of your compute you can use for AI research, limits on, for example, the use of AIs in AI research. Like, for example, they could just say AIs should refuse to assist with AI research. And
Interesting.
because we can see all the training runs happening, it's easier for us to enforce that property globally. Because we can just make it the case that every training run has a component that's like the refusal to do AI research training run. Part of the process. Okay. So everyone could just see that like all the AIs have a refusal training where they refuse to do AI research.
Does that mean like the inside of the companies, they're like programming in the old-fashioned ways that everyone has forgotten except for them, and then outside of the company, everyone's using AIs to like write all the code?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, this is the detail that we don't specify in our actual scenario, but like that's the sort of thing that we're imagining is like basically it's like the high level thing that we want is to not do an intelligence explosion and to instead have the frontier go at some cautious, reasonable pace.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of mechanisms that the governments could use to achieve that, with this high level goal of wanting to have a reasonable pace instead of an intelligence explosion. And we think that in fact, you know how I gave that progression of things and I said like in the long run, you want a more safety case based regime?
Yeah.
I think it might be possible to actually get to that long run if you start with the more simple, easy to do things and you go really slow and you have total research transparency so that the scientific community can like rapidly learn how all this stuff works and get experience, with AIs and so forth. And the regulators can like, so maybe like it wouldn't happen immediately, but maybe a couple years into the system, they would have competent regulators looking at safety cases and so forth, and actually doing a decent job of that.
So you're saying the research transparency plus the like compute monitoring on the research side basically enables coordination, because it makes it very hard to like defect on deals or cheat. Yes. Because anyone can tell that you're doing that immediately.
Like they don't even have to wait for the next auditor to come in. Like it's just like it's published to the internet right away.
And the purpose of all of this is to say like I mean, my favorite analogy here is like these are like the control rods in your nuclear reactor. Because like if you pull out the control rods in a nuclear reactor, your nuclear reactor goes critical, because like every reaction causes like even more reactions until the whole thing melts down. And this is like the place we are currently in, or we're not yet at the point of criticality. But once you have AIs that can make smarter AIs that can make smarter AIs completely autonomously, you've like achieved criticality. The control rods are the agreements that people make of saying, oh, well, we won't use AIs to make the next generation of AIs. In fact, we'll have a particular thing we're agreeing on, which is to train the AIs not to help with that and like enforce that somehow. And you can tell if it's working or not based on the transparency.
The transparency is kind of like the bedrock or the foundation that enables additional deals to be made on the fly very rapidly, and for those deals to be verified and enforced relatively easily because of the transparency. Like the transparency means that like new issues and problems and stuff like get surfaced and discussed publicly at maximum speed.
Yeah.
And then it also means that like insofar as the US and China or OpenAI and Anthropic have some sort of agreement on what they're going to do, they can just like maximally easily enforce it because they can like see what's going on. So like I think of this as the kind of like the ideal for both like speed of noticing problems and the speed of enforcing and like enforcement of deals.
Yeah.
And then like we can talk about more complicated proposals that don't have full transparency but have auditor systems and so forth as kind of like.
Well, no, I like this, and I think we can stay with the transparency regime, but I think this still a little bit to me feels like half a plan, or like it's sort of like it's setting all the conditions to do the thing that would actually prevent us from losing control and having massive concentration of power. But in your write-up, you do describe like one way this could go, right? Like you do sort of say.
So it's possible that you do the first step where you have the transparency, and then you like start doing the second step with the slowdowns and the regulations and so forth, but you mess up that second step. And then you end up building AIs that are too smart and too misaligned anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then things spiral out of control. I think that's one of the like branches that we illustrate in our scenario. And my thought there is like, well, if you're really worried about that, then maybe you should go for plan S, where we just shut it all down. It's the only way to be sure. you know? Just don't do any of this stuff.
Okay, but
I think that if you're not going to be shutting it all down and you are going to be having AIs develop, then I think that something like plan A with the transparency and so forth is like setting up the governments of the world to be in like the least bad position to make these judgment calls effectively and to go not too fast.
No, totally.
And to not allow unsafe things.
No, I think that makes sense. But I'm a little bit like, but can you pitch me on it? You know, I'm like, we both want to make it through this.
Oh, like, can I convince you why this might actually work instead of being like, we should totally do plan S?
Yes. And to me, I'm sort of with you on the like, why I get why transparency, I get why these data centers and inference only and training data centers, and I'm sort of like, well, a bunch of things would still have to happen for this plan to go well. Why do you think those things could go well, as opposed to just like, well, if we just shut it down, that's at least simpler.
I mean, frankly, I'm very sympathetic to plan S. I think that like plan A is more complicated and more likely to go wrong in certain ways. And so maybe we should actually just do plan S. But the argument I would give, the negative argument I would give for plan A and against plan S is that plan S kind of kicks the can down the road. Like, okay, you shut it down. Now what? Like 2 years later, what have you done?
Yeah.
5 years later, what have you done? 10 years later, what have you done? Like eventually people are going to start again one way or another. Maybe there's going to be a war. Maybe there's some secret project somewhere that's been continuing the whole time.
Yeah.
Like, you do have to like ultimately get the world into a stable position where the situation is actually solved instead of like a sort of
So how do we do that?
That's a negative argument for plan A.
Yeah.
The positive argument for plan A, I would say, is that I think that there's this feedback loop, which I wonder if I could show you. This is the lower half of that diagram I was mentioning. So we can get into this positive feedback loop where basically the world, like right now, the world is asleep at the wheel. Like the companies are sort of running away. They are driving the bus towards the cliff.
Yeah.
And the world is just like partying in the back of the bus and doesn't realize that this is happening.
Yeah.
But like
we don't even know we're on the bus. We're just like
there's
partying.
Like this feedback loop that could happen where
shaking.
like people wake up to this to some extent and like hit the brakes a little bit. And then that like means that we get closer to the cliff without actually going off of it, which gives time for more people to wake up and then hit the brakes more. Yeah. Which gives time for, etc.
We like look out the window, we see the cliff and we're like, oh shit.
Yeah. And that gets to the point where the bus just actually stops and we're not going off the cliff. And, does that mean the bus stays stopped forever? Maybe, but probably not. Like I actually highly doubt that we would just never actually reboot progress again for the same reasons talked about with plan S. Like I just think it just seems really, really hard to have like a technology just never be invented across the whole globe.
Yeah.
Another intuition pump I would give for this is that like, I think typically we tend to overregulate in many industries for safety reasons rather than underregulate. I think that like nuclear power, for example, is probably overregulated for safety, and like planes are like extremely safe. There's lots of rules about how you can design planes and how you have to test them and so forth. I remember I talked to an Amazon employee a few years ago who worked for the drone delivery wing.
Yeah.
And I asked him like, so why hasn't there been drone delivery yet? And he said it was over the regulatory issue where the regulators are concerned that their drones are going to start crashing into people and causing harm.
Mm-hmm.
The regulators basically want them to prove that that's not going to happen. And then they say to they complain to the regulators like, well, we use neural nets for our image recognition. you can't prove anything about neural nets. And then apparently the regulators are just like, well, sucks to suck then, can't have your drone delivery. And so that's that. And that's why we don't have drone delivery. In my opinion, that's an acceptable price to pay because some people would get hit by drones, but then we would learn and improve the systems. And like, then eventually we would have like a functioning drone delivery system that would overall be very good.
Yeah.
In the same way that like with cars, a lot of people died in car accidents, but we gradually learned from that and improved the cars, you know? Anyhow, so
it'd be like saying you can't have cars because if cars hit anyone, that's unacceptable risk, and then you just never have cars. And you're like, well,
yeah,
we should probably there should be some risk that we should be.
So like basically what I'm saying is that like if people wake up enough, then probably AI regulation would be kind of like other regulation of all these other things, all these other like economically valuable technologies like cars and so forth, where like there are a lot of restrictions on how you can do it, and it kind of goes very slow compared to how fast you could be going. And certainly you're not doing anything that looks remotely like recursive self-improvement, you know?
Yeah.
But it's still happening and you're still making, you know, incremental progress and you're still like gradually automating more parts of the economy and so forth. And because we're so close to recursive self-improvement now, like because we're just a few years away, I think that even if you sort of like really slammed on the brakes right now and then got into this regime, the absolute magnitude of the pace of progress would still feel quite a lot. Like I think that the overall pace of progress with AI would still be like one of the fastest changing technologies in history, as described in our scenario. And we can, you know, we say more about why we have those numbers basically.
Yeah.
So that's my positive case is that like, I do think that like, oh, and another positive case I would make is control. So like on a technical level, I'm extremely pessimistic about control for superintelligence or for superhuman AIs. But for AIs that are at human level, I think it should be a relatively prosaic solvable problem. So specifically, like think about how like control works for humans. Like a lot of humans are not aligned. We don't have a good way of telling whether like an employee we've hired is actually going to always, you know, obey the rules, follow the mission, act in the best interests of the company, and also obey all the laws. Quite often, companies hire employees that in fact disobey not only the company leadership, but also the laws of the country, you know? But like the system overall works. We have laws, we have incentives, we have like, you know, we have police, you know, like we have this whole system that's been built up to sort of like prevent any things from getting too bad with respect to that. And I think that you can, in principle, at least with enough effort, design something similar for AIs, where if the AIs are at like roughly human level, then you can have other AIs that are trained by different companies that monitor their behavior and look for anything suspicious. And, you know, insofar as they're giving advice to humans, you have like a legal type system where there's AIs debating different things with each other and so forth.
But I'm like, Daniel, the AIs we have right now are already like subverting company monitoring and like hacking out.
They need to improve the monitoring. Like basically I'm saying that if the AIs don't get dramatically more capable than they are now, then if we dramatically improve our game as society and like heavily increase our security, heavily increase our monitoring, etc., I think that we can get to a point where it actually just kind of works.
Yeah.
And we have AIs that like could not take over the world even if they really tried, even if they coordinated with a bunch of other AIs, because it's just too many barriers in their way. There's too many different AI factions trained by too many different companies that are too well trained to do their jobs at monitoring. And there's too many different monitors happening and too many different like security barriers between them. And
but it doesn't rely on them being actually aligned. Like it relies on them.
It does not rely on them being actually aligned.
Yeah.
I think that basically this is what I mean by control.
Yeah.
And this is a technical term in the literature. So like basically I think that even if we haven't aligned the AIs, if we invest a lot in it and go carefully and do a good job, we can get a system of control in place that is adequate to prevent like truly catastrophic AI takeover type stuff. You know, there still might be some minor accidents every once in a while, but like basically, I think we can get to a situation kind of like how it is with humans, where like some humans do some bad things, but then they get caught mostly, and it's probably fine. You know,
up to some capability.
Some capability level. I don't think that this works for like superhuman AIs. Yeah. Like for the superhuman AIs, they're going to be doing all sorts of crazy stuff that like we just can't understand, and we just have to trust them that they're acting in our best interest because we cannot evaluate whether they're actually acting in our best interest. You know?
Yeah.
And so all this system of control just goes out the window. You know,
and it's scary to me because I'm like, we don't know where that threshold is, and that's where like right now,
right? We don't know where that threshold is. It's probably around human level. You know, like I wouldn't want to go much above human level.
But I'm like, what does human level mean, right? Like you know, we can look at like the time horizon of models, right? But like, what is the human time horizon?
So the other thing is that we don't have to know like human level thing. We can just actually red team the control system. So that's another thing that gives me optimism is that like if you have some scheme of like AIs monitoring each other or whatever,
Yeah.
you can then red team it, where you specifically instruct some AIs to like
Mhm.
try to break out, try to sabotage this thing. And you don't even just instruct them, you can even train them to do it. And you can have like specially trained AIs that are like optimized, like their whole job is, and their whole like being is like breaking out of these systems and like messing with them in various ways. And then you can keep improving the system until they stop succeeding, you know?
Yeah.
And if they succeed, then now you've identified a vulnerability in the system and you can fix that vulnerability, you know? And I think that like, you know, I don't know, but I think this probably just works for AIs of like human level and below. Again, it's going to take a lot of effort. And,
Yeah.
and like I'm imagining a sort of safety case based regime where like the public in general is like quite freaked out about all the AI changes happening and is basically like trying to regulate it out of existence.
Mhm.
But then companies are like making these increasingly complicated and secure multi-layered systems to like so that they can convince regulators that like this particular system is going to work as intended. And like,
Yeah.
you know, here we red teamed it really hard and third-party auditors came in and red teamed it really hard and no one was able to break it. And so probably it will in fact work. And, you know, if it doesn't work, here's the fail safe that would allow
Yeah.
us to notice when it's not working and so forth. And therefore a regulator approves and then bam, they make tons of money from it. And like, you know, it becomes a
Okay.
normal thing. And so like, that's like the sort of type of thing that would be happening in the 2030s in our scenario, where like progress is continuing, but like there's just a lot of attention being paid to the control and the safety aspects of it, even though the AIs might still be misaligned and probably are still misaligned.
Okay.
In parallel, while this is happening, a lot of scientific progress is being made on alignment itself. So people are getting a much better understanding of like the relationship between training environments and goals, and like training environments and personality traits and so
Yeah.
forth. And like science is just advancing massively, and we have a like, you know, and
Yeah.
then like in our scenario, after like a decade of this, they've like adequately solved these problems, and they've made AIs that are just actually extremely virtuous and that it can actually trust. And then they hand off to those AIs, and those AIs build successors, which build successors, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's what happens in 2040 in our scenario. If it takes longer than that, then it takes longer than that. And like, you know, then, you know, so that would be like up for the regulators at the time and the people at the time to decide.
Okay, yeah. So I think this makes sense to me, and I think I actually really appreciate the picture of like, yeah, no, there'll be regulators, like you know, both in the U.S. and China that are like looking at what the companies are doing and like whether the companies actually have a really strong safety case, and you know, like there will also be like the governments coming together and negotiating around what's like what level of risk is permissible and how they're assessing that risk, and there'll be transparency that allows like all, you know, including all the other countries to like look at that and be like, are you guys doing an insane thing? Should we be like trying to stop you? And that this sort of like, you know, with luck and a lot of expertise, like maybe could come together and be something where we are setting a pace. Like, you know, this is the pacing the frontier that's like could actually be reasonable and could actually be safe enough to keep going forward at a measured pace. I like that sort of idea of being in that control loop and that feedback. I think where a lot of people are going to be sort of like most questioning this I mean, at least like DC people, they're gonna be like, well, okay, talk to Daniel, what about this? Like, what about China? Like, we can't trust China. Like, yeah, sure, there'd be transparency. That probably helps to some extent, but like, how do you make sure that like China, like, why would China even do this? Like, you know, would China go along with this? Like, is this possible?
I mean, this is a horse trading thing. So like, the transparency is a gift to China to some extent. Like right now, China depends on spying to get the algorithmic secrets and the training processes and so forth from the United States and leaks.
Mm-hmm.
But this would just be like just giving it to them because they're giving it to the whole internet, so
Yeah.
that they don't even have to bother with the spying anymore. Which is nice for them. I mean, personally, I think that like they're probably being pretty successful with their spying anyway, and so it's probably less of a big deal than you might think. But like, it's a concession to China. And so as part of a realistic deal, there'd have to be some sort of negotiations and horse trading. And like maybe like the US would demand some other concession from China in return for this one or whatever. And like
What type of thing? Or like,
maybe something about compute. Like in our scenario, they basically, when they're regulating their chip supply chains in their respective companies and countries, they basically agree to do it in such a way that the US maintains its compute advantage
mm-hmm.
and China doesn't like overtake the US in compute.
Yeah.
And so like that was like the concession from China to the US.
I see. So like China benefits because now it gets a ton of these algorithmic secrets.
Yeah.
But then the US like gets to keep their compute advantage. And yeah.
So like, you know, that's an example. But like we didn't have a strong opinion about exactly how all that horse trading
Sure.
would go, or like,
Sure.
and it wouldn't just be horse trading; it would also be like lots of yelling and threatening. Like presumably there'd be lots of like really intense discussions and like lots of people yelling at each other, and lots of
Yeah, because there's always World War III.
lots of tweets about World War III being on the horizon or whatever, and so forth. And that's all going to be very scary, but hopefully it works out and we end up with a deal, and hopefully it's a reasonable deal. In terms of the cheating, there I'm reasonably confident. Like I think that if you do the things that we describe and you allow inspectors to come in and like put hands on GPUs basically and like count them and things like that, then you can get you gain something like 99% of the world's AI relevant compute visible to all sides in the deal.
Yeah.
And then if you do the total research transparency, then they can not just see where the compute is, but what's happening on it as well. And then I think that you've gone a long way towards preventing cheating, because you can just like literally see what they're doing on their data centers in real time, yeah, there might be some hidden data center somewhere that they've squirreled away in a mountain in the military facility or whatever, but they will be making much slower progress on those data centers because they have such limited amounts of compute. Like AI progress does heavily depend on compute. We are pretty confident in that.
Yeah.
We're not sure exactly the degree to which it depends. Like there's a parameter for this in our model.
Nice.
But for plausible settings of the parameter, you can basically not have to worry about the covert projects for a couple years or so, or possibly a couple decades. You do have to worry about them stealing the model weights from the legal projects.
Yeah.
And you just have to eat the cost that, like, because you're being transparent about the research, then like they'll just be like copying all your latest research.
Yeah. The secret projects.
The secret projects, yeah. But basically, like one way of putting it is that like if the US and China and various other countries cooperate to have this sort of transparent system, then the countries in the transparent system and the companies in the transparent system can outrace the secret projects with a pretty comfortable margin, so that, maybe you can't pause for like 30 years, but you can pause for like 10 years, or 5 years before you start to be seriously concerned that the secret projects overtake
and you can know that the companies, the AI development that's happening in the transparent project, which is ahead, won't be, secretly subverted to serve some dictator or some general or something. Unlike the secret projects where you don't know that. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that the like transparent projects maintains that lead in this world. Is that right?
Yeah. I'd say it's not that important that the transparent projects have a big lead over the covert projects. It's more like it's important that the covert projects not pull ahead. And this is a relatively small difference, because like once they catch up, then they can possibly pull ahead. But like, yeah, I think it'd actually be kind of okay if they have same level of capability, because they just have so many fewer AIs, such a tiny amount compared to the main. So it'd be sort of like a good guy versus bad guy situation.
Inference compute.
Yeah, or just compute in general. Like right now, there's lots of bad people in the world, but the good people outnumber them, and so overall things are fine. And similarly, like if there's some bad AIs that are working for a dictator or something, that's bad, but it's like not as bad as if they're a majority of the world's AIs weighted by intelligence. And so what you're really worried about is those AIs getting substantially smarter than all the good AIs. And then like now a majority of the world's AIs weighted by intelligence are working for this evil purpose, Anyhow, yeah. So I would say like you try to get most of the compute and then you can do this thing, and then you can afford to go more slowly and cautiously, because even if all the compute you didn't get was all secretly in a project somewhere, it wouldn't be able to go as fast as you. Yeah. Basically, that's the high level idea.
Okay. I'm pretty convinced.
I think my main worry about the covert projects is the distillation thing.
Yeah.
It's a it's kind of related to the other worry. Like I think if the legal projects go too fast, then A, they could just lose control because they went too fast. And B, they could be like helping out the covert projects too much in various ways through the research and through the distillation, So I would definitely like recommend that people err on the side of going too slow rather than err on the side of going too fast.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think that's a pretty good high level. I mean, insofar as I understand Plan A.
Thank you.
Is there anything you feel like we missed that you want to cover? Either Plan A stuff or...
I mean, we could talk about we've talked most about like the core of Plan A, which is like getting this new regime for doing AI development agreed to, and like what this agreement would look like.
Yeah.
But then there's like all the consequences of that. Like what would happen to society as people lose their jobs and things like that. And like what we
what's the plan for people losing their job? Like that just seems
citizens dividend.
Okay.
So basically, like one thing you could do is a UBI where you tax the companies and then distribute the money. We think citizens dividend is slightly better. It's a different thing where like it's more like people having stock in the companies where it's like they own rather than just they're getting payments.
Yeah.
And then also, which we think is an improvement. And then also it's not a tax on the companies exactly. It's a sort of cap and trade thing where chips and robots, you need like a permit to produce them, and the permits are sold by a sort of specially government set up institution. And then people have stock in that institution, basically.
Why is that so much better than like a UBI like thing?
So one thing about the reason why I like people owning stock instead of UBI is it feels like politically harder to change. Like it feels like you're like it's kind of a vibes thing, but like if you like actually have some shares, then like if the government decides to like change things, it's like they're stealing your stuff. Whereas if it's like the government is out of the goodness of its hearts giving you some money,
I see.
then they can just like decide to give you less money in the future.
Yeah.
And then, so it's kind of a framing thing, but like I do think it should be, we should try to make it like as hard to like undo, as hard to like take back as possible. And then the other thing for the cap and trade, cap and trade is just nice, libertarian intuitions. I think it's sometimes better than taxing. And I think it also allows the governments to like, to have these nice limits on growth where like, say they're uncertain about whether the robot economy is going to be able to double, in 18 months or 6 months or whatever. They can just like set a threshold on like how many robots we're going to have this year. And then they can sell that many permits and then like, let the market decide who buys, like basically let the price system decide who buys the permits and what they do with the robots and so forth.
Yeah.
And then they can use that threshold to basically keep the doubling time to whatever level they want.
Yeah.
So like we're going to double every year, for example, or like every 18 months or something, instead of like, who knows how fast we're going to double. Let's see what Elon gets up to.
Yeah. And
and then it also just sort of smoothly means that like, as the economy grows and the AIs become more powerful and the robots become more powerful, then like the size of the effective tax basically grows in proportion to that. Where like, I think according to we have like a little economics model for this part of our scenario. And if I recall correctly, like at first the citizens dividend is like fairly small, but then like by the end, the citizens dividend is huge. And it's not just that like the AI companies have gotten huge. It's that like the AI companies have gotten huge. And also because of the cap, like most of the price of each robot is just paying for the license because they're so valuable now. The robots have improved technology and so forth. And so that means that like in some sense, it's like starting off with like a lower tax on the AI companies, but then the tax sort of automatically becomes like a bigger fraction of them as like their technology gets better in a nice sort of smooth way. I don't know. So these aren't like super necessary. These are kind of technical.
This is what I mean when I'm like, you guys have really thought through a lot of details. Like you've thought through a lot of different ways. And I also just appreciate you're like taking the future very seriously. You're like, yeah, I expect these things to happen. And so if they happen, they will have effects. And then like this will like change things. And like, how would we want to incentivize the good things to happen, not the bad things to happen? And it's easy to say that. It's easy to be like, I would like to incentivize good things, and much harder to be like, well, what is the mechanism design? Like, what should the policy be? And I hope the rest of the world can catch up with you guys and use your help and like harness the insights from Plan A, which as you say, you're like, look, here's the best we can do. Maybe there's better things. Please.
Oh, there's almost certainly better things. Like this is just our first attempt. It took us about a year. I'm sure that if more people think more seriously for more years, they can come up with better plans, and I hope they do.
Yeah, me too. But thanks for doing it first.
Thank you. And if all else fails, when in doubt, just shut it all down. like when in doubt, shut it all down. Yeah. Like we have this complicated plan that like we think is best or whatever. Like it's our current least bad plan or whatever. But like, if it looks like it's too complicated or not working or whatever. Then,
and the first step of your plan is like, let's pause capabilities right here. Let's keep serving inference
while we sort out the details.
While we sort it out. And I think that's a great first step.
Another way. Yeah.
And we can decide from there to do plan S or to do plan A or to do whatever, some other plan.
Yeah.
But that would be a good starting point.
Yeah. Oh yeah, fun fact. So in our plan S scenario, I make this point of how like even if you completely halted all AI research and only allowed existing models but no new models to be created, the world would still look extremely cyberpunk 10, 20 years later.
Why is this?
We can get more into that if you're interested. Well, like so I mean, there's different versions of Plan S. Like one version of Plan S is where you like smash all the computers and like there's like no more AIs anywhere.
Yeah.
Existing AIs are like hunted down and destroyed. You know, that's not the version that we describe in our scenario. In our scenario, it's just like a halt on further AI research, and so there's no new AIs being created, but the existing ones are grandfathered in, and like so people can continue using like Claude Mythos 5 or whatever.
Yeah.
But the point is that like Claude Mythos 5 is like a pretty powerful entity.
Sure is.
And so if you imagine just like 20 years of like NVIDIA producing more and more GPUs and running Claude Mythos 5 on them and like integrating them into everybody's like laptops and, you know, and like it would just actually be like at least an like internet scale transformation.
Yeah, no, totally.
So it would actually just change everything and make it very cyberpunk. Even if we just completely successfully paused all AI progress permanently.
Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. If people want to find your work, how do they do that? AI-2040. Oh, I think we're being interrupted. We got some donuts.
Yay!
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Claude. Did we get any chocolate ones? Do we have chocolate ones? I see a chocolate one. The future is here.
Yeah. So AI-2040.com. That's our new scenario. That's the positive vision. AI-2027.com is our more, our prediction.